In 1964, 30 million Americans lived in poverty. Although most of the poor were white, the power of the civil rights movement raised the issue to a place on the national agenda and stirred the new president to action.
Can you help us free these Americans from the prison of poverty? And if you can, let me hear your voices.
As a young man, Johnson had taught Mexican-American children in rural Texas. Later, as a congressman, he idolized Franklin Roosevelt and dreamed of completing the New Deal. He named his vision for a better America, the Great Society. It included civil rights, voting rights, support for the arts, medical care to the elderly, and help for the poor. Lyndon Johnson was a master at moving legislation through Congress, but he had no blueprint for ending poverty. For that, he looked to Shriver.
If a general was asked, I want you to launch war on Grenada, could you invade it and take it over? Well, that's something you can get your mind around. But a war on poverty, that's like saying, could you, in Franklin's purpose, could you wage war on gravity? He thought, oh my God, how am I going to do this?
He began by ordering research. And then he went looking for what the author Michael Harrington called the other America, the invisible poor. In Appalachia, Shriver saw schools that were shacks and heard stories of children eating dirt from the inside of stovepipes. In the Deep South, he witnessed the rule of Jim Crow, whereby black children were kept out of school to pick cotton, while their parents faced violence if they attempted to vote. In the North, most blacks were confined to ghettos, cut off from good schools, housing, and jobs. When Shriver saw the research he ordered, he was stunned. Of all the nation's poor people, half were children.
He became very, very committed to the point where this was no longer just a political assignment or something he needed to do because the president asked him, but this was something that had to be done and done right, and he became very passionate about it.
People are interested in being treated as human beings. They're interested in having other people treat them, as the Declaration of Independence says, as equals. That's the first thing that's needed in the war against poverty.
The civil rights movement had really elevated the notion of equality, and he wants to extend that spirit now to programs to end poverty nationwide.
You have to have that sense of human respect and dignity and equality before these other specific programs, like a health program or an educational program, can have its maximum effect.
Mr. Shriver, you say that you hope that something...
Shriver called up anyone who knew anything about poverty. Activists, scholars, the priests and nuns who worked among the poor, and the reporters who wrote about them. In 16 weeks, they had a plan.
It's not a program of federal handouts to alleviate poverty temporarily. It is aid to help those who are willing to help themselves get out of poverty by building up their skills, increasing their employability.
Shriver hated the idea of handouts, which he equated with what he called cheap grace, a kind of a charity which does not empower people.
The plan created OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity. As in the Peace Corps, he wanted the poor to lift themselves out of poverty, and he wanted privileged Americans to work among them. OEO launched VISTA, Head Start, Youth Corps, Job Corps, Upward Bound, Foster Grandparents, Work Study, and a way to give poor communities resources for their own anti-poverty programs called Community Action.
Community action, as its name implies, is local action. We depend completely on local communities to come to Washington with their own programs of combating poverty in the ways that they see fit to do it in their own hometown.
Everybody's talking about our country's problems. Why not do something about them? The name of the game is VISTA, Volunteers in Service.
Shriver returned to the college campuses and urged students and teachers to practice what he called the politics of service.
Not by more courses and responsibility, not by lectures, not by commencement speeches, but by political action
in this true sense of politics in the service of your city.
It mobilizes a tremendous cohort, particularly of young Americans, who are now being challenged in a way in which they felt they had not been challenged before.
It was a time in history when it was clear that it's the right thing to do and you could do it. Just do it. Everybody get involved and do what you can do.
Within a year, OEO announced that the war on poverty had reached 3 million people. Newsweek wrote, "The poor were no longer invisible."
As of today, 1,000 American communities have organized themselves into community action groups.
The newly formed groups met in churches and community centers, making plans to improve life in their city neighborhoods and small towns.
The water should be on.
It was the first time poor communities had authority and federal money to tackle problems where they lived.
I think that this is a problem that this group should be actively involved in.
They use the influx of federal money to tackle problems like transportation, like child development, like education, like healthcare, like slum conditions.
Shriver reasoned that for the poor to have some control over decisions affecting their lives, OEO needed to fund community action groups independent of City Hall, even though he knew that would anger local politicians. And it did.
And they said, what the hell is Shriver doing? Big city mayors were outraged by community action, and they argued, we're the duly elected representatives of the people.
In Newark, Los Angeles, Cleveland, Chicago, action groups carried out rent strikes against slum landlords and protested government policies that maintained segregation. They charged mayors with neglecting their schools and city services and accused them of favoring more affluent communities. Inside the war on poverty, battles erupted in communities across the country in a struggle for power.
From the perspective of the activists themselves, it's a stepping stone for them to get their issues heard and to finally get the city to pay attention and do something about their problems. And sometimes that means they're on a collision course with big city mayors. And so for the mayors, it looks like the federal money is helping these rabble-rousers make trouble.
All they had to do was pick up a telephone, dial a number, and say, we are still working on it.
Shriver met with the nation's mayors to try to ease tensions. We're not trying to exclude mayors, he said, but we want to bring everyone in.
Let's all of us have enough of the spirit of our country and enough compassion to unbar the door to all who are poor.
But few mayors were moved.
And by joining
In his defense, Shriver told Congress that the war on poverty was not just to help poor people change, but that hostile or uncaring institutions also had to change, especially government. A year into the war on poverty, Shriver found another way to make that happen.
When he found himself politically blocked, what more natural thing would there be but to turn to the law and to see if the law could be made an ally to the poor?
The poor need and deserve the same quality of legal services that the profession owes to all citizens.
He makes an incredible speech, and he pulls the ABA into the community action program through legal services to the poor.
In January of 1966, Shriver opened neighborhood law offices across the country.
We will be representing the poor people. We will continue to accept cases. And
along comes this little pipsqueak lawyer program that says if you keep doing things the way you have been doing, like discriminating against folks who are black or folks who are Hispanic or kids who have arrest records as juveniles, we're just going to have to sue you.
They sued school boards and city governments for discrimination and employers for unfair labor practices.
He had Ronald Reagan, amongst other folks, call him up and say, hey, what are your lawyers out in California doing this? They're suing the Department of Labor. That's me. You're giving them money to sue me. What's going on here?
They were talking about inequality. And all of a sudden, these state commissioners get dragged into a courtroom, the superintendent of schools, the mayor.
Leaders of both parties complained that legal services and community action were a bunch of Boston Tea Parties. And they were dumbfounded. Shriver dared to give federal money to the poor to sue local governments.
He bought into a mess of trouble and stood by it. He was putting his personal capital on the line for this. All the credibility that he had bought with the Peace Corps, all of the credibility of a Kennedy family connection, and his own reputation as somebody from the private sector who'd been successful.
We expect action at the community level. And when you've got action, you've got arguments, you've got dissent, you've got differences of opinion. That's what we're financing. For the first time in the history of this country, poor people actually have a place and a way in which to express themselves. That's community action. Anybody who thinks that isn't action misplaces or misinterprets the situation. They think community action must mean community apathy or community torpor or community death. We're creating life at the community level. And when you got life, you got movement, you got dissension, you got action. That's what we want.
Congressman Powell says something.
Shriver pushed and pleaded with local officials to move over and share power with those who are to be helped. But it can't be token involvement, he said. It must be real.
That question of whether or not the solution to the problems of the country and society involve a partnership of all people or simply involve the workings of those people who are already established leaders, that's the central controversy. And I think that how so many people come on the other side of the issue than Shriver does tells us that for many people the question was not solving poverty, but maintaining power.
By the summer of 1966, America had become deeply polarized. Riots erupted in the black ghettos of the nation's cities, sending shockwaves across the country. Government reports attributed the riots to a lack of jobs, poor schools, and feelings of isolation from the larger society. Twice, Shriver pressed Johnson for a six-fold increase in his anti-poverty budget. He said, if you want to wage a war on poverty, this is how you do it. Johnson rebuffed both appeals. He needed the money for another war in Vietnam. Growing divisions between black and white, young and old, hawks and doves, threatened the Great Society and strained Shriver's relationship with the president. Privately, Johnson complained that Shriver had started a damn revolution. The war on poverty was embattled on all fronts, and a struggle for power in the Deep South was about to imperil the entire effort.